My name is Ginny, also known as 2/3 Lotus, everywhere on the internet. This clip is part of my series, The Poets of Twitch, where I analyze my viewers' writing live on stream. Nothing has been edited out, so you're seeing this exactly as streamed with all of the imperfections and tangents that come with being live. If you want to catch me live or want more information, check out the description. Otherwise, enjoy some excellent writing. Beautiful. This is a letter to the grieving. You are uniquely suffering, and no one will be able to understand, not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried in a harpoon, through tragedy it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. You will discover that the wound scars over. It will remain tender and the pain will still surge through you, but you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. It has passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. Look further and you will see the ancient network grief weaves. It was carried not just by this tragedy, but all others, countless beyond your knowing. Pull on the thread and let others pull on yours as well. They will need you because you understand in your own way. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound, but let yourself be pulled. All will not be well, my friend, but be strong and you can help yourself and others. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. Very nice poem. It is very, it's very, the word I'm looking for, it is direct, this poem. Deeply direct, I think. I don't feel you skirting around issues too much with metaphor and all of that poetic nonsense. It often feels that you just say your thoughts here. This is sort of my broad impression, and this I enjoy. This is not writing that I'm good at. You said it might not be my style. It's not the way I write, but it is poetry that I like to read and analyze. I always like to read things that I could not in a million years write myself, right? And something like this is not something I could put on a page in the best way possible. There's like this YouTube short or TikTok that I made that was talking about this. One of my big things that I say is I wouldn't write something this way. I would not put these ideas into the page this way. And yet that is a beautiful thing and a perfect thing, because kind of like the grief that you mentioned in the poem, we all understand, we all find our wellness in our unique, in our own way, because you understand in your own way, which is very cool, right? This was good. Also, I'm gonna start drinking the last of the alcohol in the fridge, because it's there and I'm bored. As long as the last of the alcohol in the fridge is not half a bottle of hard liquor, go for it, Turning Devil, but make good choices. I'm going to read this poem again. A Letter to the Grieving. by MatthewDiLoreto. You are uniquely suffering, and no one will be able to understand, not to any extent that will alleviate your sorrow. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs, and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. You will discover that the wound scars over. It will remain tender, and the pain will still surge through you. But you will also see the thread, carried by that harpoon. It always remains. It has passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. Look further, and you will see the ancient network of grief. See the ancient network grief weaves. It was carried not just by this tragedy, but all others, countless beyond your knowing. Pull on the thread and let others pull on yours as well. They will need you because you understand in your own way. You feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound and let yourself be pulled. All will not be well, my friend, but be strong, and you can help yourself and others. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. Thank you for the follow-up. Bell's Lodge. We are currently reading a poem by chatter MatthewDiLoreto. My goal is to try to pick one metaphor or one analogy, one idea, and write directly as possible as I can, because I think that kind of writing grips me, shakes me. I want it to have the appeal of a sermon, but without the appeals to religion. Interesting. A sermon. I like this word for this poem. I do. This makes a lot of sense to me. You get up there on stage, not literally. I don't know if you would perform this spoken, but you get up, you communicate this to people, direct, understandable, something, one idea that sticks in one's mind. Like if there's something that sticks here, right? The idea that grief is a harpoon and grief is a thread, right? Like this is something that is very vivid. So I think this is a good... I think it's an approach that works well for some people. It seems like it works well for you. It doesn't tend to work well for me. I'm a mix 5 metaphors type of girly, but I like this. Oh, welcome, Raiders. Thank you, Bell's Lodge, for coming in. And my name is Ginny, also known as 2/3 Lotus. Ring the bells, it's a bells raid, yes. And we are currently reading a poem by MatthewDiLoreto, who is in chat right now. And that's what we do here. We analyze poetry and people send me stuff, and it's super fun. And let me give you a shout out from my computer, which is like far away. But how was your stream, Bell's Lodge? What were you up to? Did you do anything exciting, fun? Love that. I used to read public domain works on stream. I've taken a break from that since and do a lot of other, since you have a lot of other things going on. Yeah, reading on stream is a very fun thing. I was sort of considering this as something to do, but I think it's more fun to, for me, read things directly from people in chat, and that's like anyone. And in fact, if you do like a command in chat, !submit, anyone, new, old, whoever, inexperienced, experience is able to submit your work to me through a Google form if you want to see your work on stream. I'm currently editing the first 3 short stories together into a single book. It's due for republication on the 20th of this month. Congratulations, Bell's Lodge. publishing is huge. Republication, sure, but still huge. Your first 3 short stories. I'm working currently on a short story. It's not as long probably as yours, given that 3 of yours make up a book. Mine is gonna maybe end up being 10 pages or something. But otherwise, I mostly just write poetry. But we are working as a community here on my channel well, I'm sort of working on it right now until I get some stuff figured out, but we're going to publish a poetry anthology called The Poets of Twitch, and it's going to be like a regular thing, like a couple times a year. And it's going to have work from me and my community and everyone and the poets of Twitch. Having my first meeting with like someone to print, it's going to be in like zine form. So I know this cool like zine printing person. Yeah, I think it's cool. And if you need to take care of yourself, you or anyone coming in with the raid, please do, get some water, get a snack. If you need to turn off stream, rest your eyes, I totally understand. And we're gonna get back into this poetry. MatthewDiLoreto, you had said, because when you're in a grief state, people usually only can give you platitudes, and you can be alienating. Yeah, for sure. This is an understandable sentiment. I do ask though, MatthewDiLoreto, in your explanations of your poem, it would be greatly appreciated if you just hold those a little bit until later, so that once I sort of have my initial thoughts, then I will be happy to listen to yours. I like to come to the reading of the poem myself. This is usually how we do it. You'll be lurking? Well, thank you, Bell's Lodge. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for the lurk, and thank you for the raid. So, let's get back into this. You're uniquely suffering, and no one will be able to understand, not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs, and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. I find this poem very interestingly structured, right? We sort of open with a very powerful statement, I think. No one will be able to understand. Sometimes people look for this in grief. People will say, oh, I understand, I feel for you, I empathize. And in that sense, this becomes a rather bold claim. No one will be able to understand you. And I do think anything that is trying to comment on a fairly well-worn topic, let's say grief. I think we write lots of poems about grief and like the deep emotions. You want to say something unique. And I do think opening a poem by saying, no one will be able to understand you, is powerful, right? And then we elaborate on this, right? Into connection. Which at first made me think, oh, this feels like it's going in sort of different directions. No one will be able to understand, they cannot alleviate your sorrow. But then we sort of switch gears. The invisible thread that connects us. And it's a harpoon. And as we get later, grief weaves a network, and others will understand you you understand in your own way. They will need you because you can understand them in a way. And I thought like this is sort of an interesting move here, I guess, literarily. No one will be able to understand. You understand in your own way. I think this is generally reflective, unless there is a sort of double standard of self here, but the fact that we say at the same time that others will need you and you can understand them, and simultaneously that you will not be understood, is interesting to me. It definitely stuck out. And I think it makes this a little more complicated than one might initially see on surface level. Because sometimes a poem about grief is just like, oh, you need to help yourself. Sometimes a poem about grief is, oh, you need to lean on others and find community. This lands somewhere in between, which is nice. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound, let yourself be pulled. All will not be well, my friend, but be strong and you can help yourself and others. It's interesting. It's actually kind of taking me a minute to draw anything from this poem. Like or connect things as they should be. Let's just go line by line. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. So this speaks, of course, maybe not of course, but the harpoon, jagged hole in your chest. This is, well, tragedy. It is pain, it is suffering. This is sort of the inciting event, perhaps, behind this poem or behind any sort of grief. The wound throbs and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. So we say now here. And this is, I think, excellent. I like the use of now here. Because if we were to just say attend to the bleeding, there's very little urgency. Now is an extremely urgent word. I mean, sometimes we don't use it in an urgent way, but it says in this moment, right? Attend to the bleeding immediately. And this, of course, means whenever we say something like now or here, it often implies that that thing excludes something else. So if we are doing something now, we are not doing it later. If we are going to this place, we are not going to another place. It's sort of like an implied juxtaposition. And we do have this idea of the self grieving and the others grieving. So attend to the bleeding now implies an urgency and to help yourself first. Right, this is a letter to someone who is grieving, and the command is attend to the bleeding now. If we think of a wound, these are things that fester, these are things that get worse. We know that as we suffer with grief, people will tell us, you want to take time immediately to process it, and if you just bury it down underneath other things, underneath life, and try to distract yourself, you're not really going to improve in your grieving. So attend to the bleeding, your own bleeding, and attend to it now. This I like. Do not disturb. Okay. You will discover that the wound scars over. It will remain tender, and the pain will still surge through you, but you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. This poem is actually very chronological, I feel. This is interesting because it's also very metaphorical. I find that oftentimes if we're too steeped in metaphor, it becomes difficult to tell something like a cohesive story. This is what I suffer from. I also don't care too much to tell a chronological story. But first, we experience grief, we get hit by the harpoon, we cannot breathe, and we attend to ourselves. And then you will discover that the wound scars over, remain tender, and you will see the thread. Again, implying something. The fact that we see the thread here, but the thread is first mentioned here, sort of implies that we do not see the thread yet. We are still isolated in some way, right? And this makes sense. We cannot breathe, we attend to our own bleeding in our isolation, and we cannot really see the way we are connected until we have sort of at least dealt with our pain on some requisite level. It will remain tender and the pain will surge through you, but you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. It has passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. So, if others have been snared by the thread, they are also grieving. If we pull on it and draw them close, this is now a chance to care for others. And let others care for us. And as a poem, this being a letter to the grieving, I think this is starting to actually offer like a really strong roadmap of what one might do, or what you suggest someone might do in a time of grief. You begin, you need to understand your pain is unique, you need to feel it, you will feel it, you will feel like you are dying in some way, or that you are overwhelmed, you can barely breathe, you are just getting by, and you need to help yourself. And then, at some point you will at least start to get a scar, or a scab, maybe. You say a scar. The wound starts to scar over. It still hurts, it's still there. But now we have the capacity to look down, see the threads, see each other's, help others, because we are no longer in that degree of pain. And as that is alleviated, as we draw others closer, we will see how large this network is. It was carried not just by this tragedy, but all others, countless beyond your knowing. And now we imply something even larger. I don't think I've personally experienced deep and painful grief in my life. My parents are alive. The two grandparents who died I was not particularly close to. And all my friends have stayed alive and that kind of stuff. All my family, whatever, right? But it makes sense. So in some way, I feel disconnected from this like network that grief weaves, but I can intellectually understand. Going through something deeply painful gives you some amount of perspective on grief, how to deal with it, how to come to move past it, and how to help others through it. And engaging with this network will help. You say, as you pull on the thread, as you let others pull you, because we need each other, right? We can try to understand. But this is only really possible once we have in some way helped ourselves, at least as the poem goes. This probably makes sense to me. If you're deeply grieving and immediately turn to someone else, people often become attached and dependent on them and are sort of unable to really cope with it on their own. You'll feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound. Let yourself be pulled. And this paints a really excellent picture of like helping others. Because helping reminds you of your wound. Helping causes you to suffer. Helping causes suffering. This I've grappled with in a greater capacity than like grief itself, but to take other people, to pull on their thread, to let them into your lives, to help them, to tend their wounds in addition to your own. I mean, necessarily, we are all wounded in some way. You helping them means you are not going to attend to your wound quite so much, which makes this poem an excellent piece of advice. Don't just tend to other wounds. Don't let yourself bleed out on the floor while trying to help others. Instead, care for yourself in and amongst that action. All will not be well, my friend, but be strong, and you can help yourself and others. Right? Be strong. Interests me, certainly. Because I think being strong, the main action I find taken by the person in regards to themselves in this poem is attending to their own wounds, right? Finding the strength to care for oneself. And finding the strength to not care for others when you need to care for yourself is what I feel like this strength is referring to. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. The strength to help, but to help in a measured way, to keep yourself sane, to keep yourself healthy, to keep yourself happy, keep yourself fighting grief, and yet simultaneously help others in the ways that you can. It's a very measured sort of ethos on life, and one that I can probably appreciate. I also feel like I can't write this poem, for example, because I do not practice this. I'm very bad at just like helping others and letting myself bleed out on the floor, as I said. Welcome, Nerdarine. Drowning Devil. Hey, may I submit something else and ask you to delete the one you have? So I'm looking back and I don't really want the one submitted to be looked over anymore. That's fine, Drowning Devil, yes. Let me know what the title is and I'll do it later, okay? Once we're done with MatthewDiLoreto's poem. And Nerdarine, how are you? My throat is like very sore. Or it's like getting scratchy. And I don't know if it's like the particulate matter in this tea or just that I'm talking and I talked a lot yesterday. The blood that spills will... Yeah, that one. You're good. You're at work, getting yourself hyped for tonight. Is tonight your D&D session, Nerdarine? Thinking of what I want to say next with this poem. Oh, it's the celebration stream. That's right, Nerdarine. Very exciting. And hi, Caliber. Welcome in. We have multiple people coming in. Just about as I'm sort of thinking of taking a little break and running an ad to pace around my room and think about this poem a little bit, and then come back, because I think you need to take like at least 2 distinct looks at a poem. An initial, and then a more refined, to really say something real. I maybe want to talk about the harpoon and the network of grief. And I'll do so in a minute. So I'll be right back. Don't watch the ads. Do some self-care, drink some water, go to the bathroom. I'm going to refill my tea.
Hello and welcome back to me. We are steeping another tea. Oh, that's hot. Okay. Here we are. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. I'm going to read it again. You are uniquely suffering, and no one will be able to understand. Not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried on a harpoon, through tragedy it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs, and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. You will discover that the wound scars over. It will remain tender, and the pain will still surge through you. But you will also see the thread. Carried by that harpoon, always remains. It has passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. Look further and you will see the ancient network grief weaves. It was carried not just by this tragedy, but all others, countless beyond your knowing. Pull on the thread. Let others pull yours as well. They will need you, because you understand in your own way. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound, but let yourself be pulled. All will not be well, my friend, but be strong, and you can help yourself and others. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. Something I almost wish is there was more harpoon in this poem. Like, we talk about the thread, but I think there are probably things we can do with the harpoon and, like, sort of metaphors of the sea. The sea is a vast and dangerous place. Water is associated with sorrow. But I also know that you mentioned that you like the singular metaphor of just like the harpoon and the thread going through, right? And I wouldn't suggest you write anything but what you like. And this works, right? It gets my head spinning. Oh, harpoon. Well, the ancient network grief weaves countless beyond your knowing, fathoms beyond my knowing. It's a double meaning with like the ocean, right? But these are not necessary edits. So, I wonder how far this can be extended beyond the grieving. This is a letter to the grieving. This is what it says. There's a very clear and direct meaning about that. But is it possible that this poem can have meaning more broadly, than just in relation to grief? This is sometimes something I enjoy speculating on within a poem, or just trying to come to within a poem, right? This poem talks strictly about grief and like all of that, but maybe we can use grief as a metaphor for some broader sense of like life and how we can go through living our lives in a much broader way. Maybe, maybe not. So we begin with you are uniquely suffering. And this is sort of something that leads me to maybe want to take this train of thought. You're uniquely suffering. And suffering comes in many shapes, sizes, forms, degrees, and severities, right? Depends on who you ask, but some people would call life suffering. That would be the Buddhists. But suffering can really be described as like any pain, or even any like discomfort in life, right? This is how I like to see suffering. I tend to appreciate the Buddhist life is suffering kind of view on things. And so when I see something like this, I'm like, well, yes, we're talking about grief, but can we be talking about the ways, the little sufferings that we experience on a day-to-day basis in general? You're uniquely suffering. Often, always, daily. We suffer on a daily basis. I don't think anyone goes through a full day without experiencing some degree of suffering. And no one will be able to understand, not to any extent that it would alleviate your sorrow. So this could mean then that, it's similar, the meaning is still fairly clear, but our lives are fundamentally unique. Lives are unique. That is not how you spell unique. That's a G. We are struggling. Right? Everyone's life is fundamentally unique, and thus we cannot completely and deeply understand each other, nor can we understand each other's suffering, sorrows, whatever word we want to use to describe the sensation of the human condition, fundamentally, I think. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. So now we get somewhere interesting. If we're talking about grief not as grief, but as the fundamental suffering of life or something, the ways that the human condition, right? And that means grief is experienced very, very soon. Babies come out of the womb crying a lot, right? And at very least they'll cry pretty quick. And grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. So this gives a very reassuring view on life if we look at it this way. Everyone has their own sufferings, their own pains, their own tribulations, trials, whatever. And it is the fact that we all experience these things, perhaps, and know and communicate them, that we are in a way human to each other. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. And in many ways we do this, in many ways we don't. Attend to the bleeding now. But then this says, more broadly, maybe more on a scale of one's life and how to deal with the pain, to find a way to cope with the broader issues of life, one's purpose, one's meaning, immediately, now. This is something we should learn to do. We should figure out how to get through life happily and safely and without too much suffering. And of course, the suffering remains. The human condition, we are bound perhaps to want and to feel things like greed and desire. But we will understand that we have these many threads connecting us. And I think seeing the threads, seeing the connections to others is something that's going to help us not suffer in many ways, or at least not inflict more suffering. Again, this human understanding. you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. Right? Once we have suffered, it is part of our existence, and we know. It has passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. Look further, and you'll see the ancient network grief weaves. There's always been suffering, there always will be. It was carried not just by this tragedy, but all tragedy, all experience, countless beyond your knowing. Pull on the thread, let others pull yours as well. They will need you because you understand in your own way. So beyond just grief, we all have our own understanding of life and a unique experience, and we meet each other, we experience each other, we talk to each other, we share art, and we communicate. And this unique experience, like reading a poem, is a way that we need each other. You'll feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. I think this is important. So this goes back to the earlier idea that we also need to acknowledge that it's not just about helping others. This is something I did in my poetry. I used to write, and everything I wrote, I would share, and hope would help someone else, or garner some kind of attention and dialogue, and make a difference for someone. And this certainly has happened, and it will continue to happen. But I realized a few weeks ago, I said it for a long time, I don't think a poem is a poem until you share it with someone else. I believed this deeply, because art is a form of communication. But lately I've started writing poems in a journal that is just for me. And in this way, I am able to tend to my own wounds. And learn more so how to be okay and how to be stable in myself, while at the same time allowing myself to be pulled, and in that very same action of writing poetry, occasionally be able to, or often be able to, healthily, carefully, safely share my joy, share my beauty, and allow myself to connect to others. Right? I need to stop saying right at the end of sentences. All will not be well. And if we connect back to this unique suffering, this being a human condition sort of thing, then yes, nothing will ever be well. We fundamentally we're never going to be happy. And we have a million ways to describe that we will never be happy in life. We can talk about, the hedonic treadmill. This is the idea where hedonism, right, it is a treadmill where if you seek physical things, right, this person is running, right, on a treadmill, and it goes round and round and round and round and round. And this is used as a metaphor for hedonism. I want this thing. I want money. I want power. I want a car. I want, let's say you're a cis hetero rich man. You want women. These are things. This is part of the hedonic treadmill. And sometimes we think that if I get one more thing, I will be better. And I will not. All will not be well. We talk also, perhaps, about the mountain and Sisyphus pushing his rock up the mountain. And fundamentally, he will fall back down. All will not be well. This is sort of different because we must imagine Sisyphus happy or whatever, but we have many, many metaphors. We have the Buddhists who just tell us, life is suffering, right? Flat out. This guy, the Buddha, right? He says life is suffering, and there's no way around that, and you just sort of have to, like, deal with that. There are ways to deal with it, and we can be strong, we can help ourselves and others, we can find community. But if we look at this poem on, like, a much, much larger scale, then I think it also just speaks to community and how we help each other and how we are all beings who are struggling to get through our little lives in the human condition and the pain that we go through. And that one of the ways we can do that is to help each other, right? Wonderful perspective. Your own poetry, you can speak to yourself. You are your own audience. Yeah, that's sort of what I'm thinking with these poems. And even if I'm not speaking to myself, like, sometimes it's just about expressing something. Because I have a lot of thoughts in my head that swirl around, and, like, sometimes they're just not able to be expressed to others, or in a space that is not in solitude. And this is sort of exactly what this poem says, with attending to the bleeding, to your bleeding now, right? I feel like I've been cutting onions in my dreams. Do you wake up crying? Do you have sad dreams, Excalibur? So, these are sort of my analytic thoughts on this poem. I would say, like I said, I saw this poem and I'm like, this is fairly straightforward. It's about grief, it's about how we deal with it, and this is nice. And it is done well. And then, of course, I also sort of brought it up into a larger scale of a human condition type thing. There might be other ways we can grab this and twist it to different metaphors of broader ideas, but that's not always the most productive thing to do with a poem. Not that I really care about productivity, but not the most useful. You did have a bunch of questions, and I will now read your questions. You have a lot. This MatthewDiLoreto is, this makes me happy. So, everyone else in chat who sends me poems, take notes here. This is all MatthewDiLoreto's thoughts and questions and comments. This helps me deeply. This gives me so much to talk about. So thank you. People need something to turn to in times of grief. Yeah. They feel tremendous yearning for what they lost, for a future that is now dead to them. What they may not realize is another part of their yearning is for an acknowledgement of their experience. Yes, the other people, the pulling the threads. Sometimes family provides this acknowledgement, sometimes religious authorities or a therapist. But sometimes it's the forlorn souls that inhabit the depraved fringes of society. Grief is a transformative experience, and dealing with it can lead people to harm themselves in ways they do not understand. It can be the acid that dissolves the soul. You were, like, very, very poetic in this little description here. What I seek to accomplish with this piece is to compose a letter that can serve as a bulwark for my loved ones and acquaintances in their times of sorrow. I'm actually planning on physically handing this piece, handwritten, folded up neatly, into the palm of a person I love during a wake, funeral, whenever I see them hurting from grief. I want it to be short, pithy, and express the deepest and most profound understanding of their pain. I want the visual metaphor of a thread, carried on a harpoon, to cling in their mind during their darkest spirals and be a symbol for them to heal, like a tether to the goodness of the world. As a gross oversimplification, here's the outline for the piece. You are sad. I know that sadness others do too. Here's a symbol for you to cling to. Let the symbol heal you. I love you. I would love to help with the flow and cadence of the writing and eliminate absolutely every word that is not essential to conveying my message. This is something I'm good at, eliminating words. MatthewDiLoreto. So we can definitely do that. I think something you should do, which would be, like, really cute. Like, not cute. I think this is this fundamentally becomes sort of like a performative piece of art. And I don't mean that in a bad way. Performance art is beautiful. But you have this poem, you hand it to someone in this time, in this specific scenario, and it creates a broader context for the piece of art. I think you should have it in like a nice little envelope, and you should tie it with some nice thread. Just like a colored like thread. Could be black, could be gold, could be like blue or something. Doesn't really matter, but an actual thread. This I like. We're talking about this as a piece of art as a whole. But you want this to have flow and cadence and illuminate every word that is not essential to your writing. And this, I think, is something that we can absolutely work on. And I think that means, like, you've already taken a very good approach. One metaphor, simple, straightforward. You don't need to be Ginny on Twitch to analyze and understand this poem. You know, this isn't high caliber talking about wearing the skin of a tiger, which is an awesome poem, high caliber. But that one is like slightly more dense, right? So the initial approach is already like a good one. And I also think, so if we're talking about understanding someone else's grief, right? Using all will not be well and you are uniquely suffering work very well. I think sometimes like the worst thing you can hear from someone is it'll get better, because you're grieving, you're engaging with this thing. This isn't something that just is supposed to get better in many cases, and it's not something like you just want someone to understand the actual grief and the actual pain. You don't want someone to look to the future, like it's about now. So this is probably a good approach as well. I've been referenced, the chickens on my brain are feeding and I'm all out of chicken feed. This, yes, I color. But how can we cut things out of this? Let's go line to line. You are uniquely suffering. So, there are sort of two ways to cut down a poem. One is to cut down the language, and one is to cut down the ideas. Oh, this is actually a really good thing for me to talk about. These two things. Cutting down the language. This means taking out extraneous words. Things like and, or like in many cases we can cut out a lot of specifiers and conjunctions and whatever in a poem. It can also mean cutting out weak language. Something like the word thing, or like passive voice, like do or does or was. These are not very exciting, and these tend to water down your poem. These often can make your poem feel very much like boring, banal speech. And I think sometimes we want our poems to really have deep emotional impact. We can cut out specific words, we can cut out weak language. These are ways we can make our poem more linguistically, I suppose, efficient. We can also make our ideas more efficient, right? And this means, let's say, cutting down on unrelated metaphor. Sometimes we want unrelated and wild and interesting metaphors to like add a sort of depth of idea to our poem. But sometimes we don't. Sometimes we do just want to cut down and distill to a single idea. And this means pulling out stuff like that. This means getting rid of like, this is interesting because so things that are off topic. And say, well, how do I know it's off topic? It's actually a very hard question, especially as an analyst and like someone giving feedback compared to the actual writer. But I do think both the writer and the analyst can understand or come to understand what the topic is and how we are either on topic or off topic and how we deal with that. The most important thing to finding what is off topic. What is one thing? I'm going to ask you, chat. What is something we have to absolutely know if we want to find what is off topic in our poem? There's one thing that matters greatly in the poem, and if we don't know this, we will never know what is off topic. What do we need to know? It's not a trick question. The topic, yes. Perfect, MatthewDiLoreto. These questions are so obvious that sometimes we miss them. And I think that's important. And there's no blame to someone for missing that. Because we don't write our poems thinking about the topic often. This is actually a poem where you might have. But sometimes we just say, I'm going to write some emotions down. I'm going to write my feelings in this moment. I'm going to write about something. There's our topic. But then we kind of meander and go elsewhere a lot of the time in our writing. Writing is a fluid thing. And writing is very different from analysis. We're not doing analysis as we write generally. Unless you're me sometimes. Or people who like analysis. But I wouldn't recommend it. So we need to know our topic. And this poem is a very interesting thing. Because one thing we can say, the topic of this poem is grief. But this is a very broad topic, right? It doesn't really tell us about the things we have to do, the things we have to communicate in our poem. We just know that we somehow need to relate to grief. So I think we need to get more specific than something like grief. And you do have more details for us, so this is like really excellent, and I think you're absolutely like on the right track in like refining this poem, MatthewDiLoreto. Your message. So here's the outline. You're sad, I know that sadness. Here's a symbol to cling to, a symbol to heal you. I love you. So this makes the topic more of an approach or a process or a symbol to reach healing. Maybe that's a topic, right? A bulwark for my loved ones and acquaintances in their times of sorrow. You said earlier in chat, you would like it to feel like a sermon. These are all more useful as topics than something extremely broad like grief. We could also think of using a word like, and no one likes when I say this, what is the thesis of this poem? And this sounds like extraordinarily academic, but I really like the word thesis when we talk about our art. And let's just define thesis. Definition. A statement or theory that is put forward as a premise to be maintained or proved, or a long essay or dissertation involving personal research written by a candidate for a college degree. See more. So, let's talk about the first one. A statement or theory that is put forward as a premise to be proved. That's a lot of words. So basically, what we want to prove is our thesis. This sounds very almost like aggressive in the form of a poem, and we're not always trying to prove something, but we can say what we're trying to say, what we're trying to communicate, what we want someone to feel. And if we can have our sort of poetic thesis, right, as the emotions, ideas, arguments, because sometimes we argue in our poem, arguments we seek to communicate. That is roughly your poem's thesis. And I think knowing this will help you deeply in refining your poem and saying, well, here is exactly what I want to get across. Because if we know very, very clearly our poetic thesis, we can take out anything that doesn't seem to support our thesis. And I like using the word thesis because we think about an essay in school, right? 5-paragraph essay. Introduction is the beginning, right? And then we have a topic, and then we have a topic, whatever, right? And we lay out our thesis at the start somewhere, probably here. And then we use a few distinct examples to communicate this point. And I think a great essay in like school or something, or just a creative essay, this is something I want to do, more creative essay work, does not waste a single topic. It does not waste a single line in communicating its thesis. This is probably what schools should be saying when they teach you about theses. They usually say like, oh, the thesis is the topic, relate to it. But I think what teachers need to be saying is the thesis is everything. It is the summation. It is the distillation of your entire point. And everything you do should in some way relate back to the thesis. You get students in high school writing essays that like have things that diverge into tangent and don't necessarily loop back and point to the original idea. But the essay, the art, the piece is about communicating an idea. Especially as you say here, you have a specific thing in mind. Handing someone a beautiful piece to support them in a time of need. And I like this. I think this is a beautiful thing you can do for people you love. So, I'm not sure if I should try to pull a thesis from this, or MatthewDiLoreto, if you would like to write like a sentence that encapsulates what this poem is trying to do. Right? And I think we need to keep it somewhat short, because if we try to do too many things, at least in a poem like this, we're going to get muddied. Like in school, use a thesis statement, one sentence, that's what it is. So I guess that's sort of up to you. Because fundamentally we should be doing this ourselves. Maybe I can do it to like sort of show how I would think about doing this, but maybe you have a grasp on what I'm saying. Maybe I sound crazy and then I can do it and show you. But the goal I think is to be able to come to these understandings ourselves. If we can come to know exactly what we're trying to say in our poem on our own, look at it, do all this, then we're going to be really good at like refining and creating poems that say something meaningful. And this is really sort of me advising you to use analysis, all of you, as part of the artistic process. Instead of, say, just writing it, letting the poem go out there sort of raw, which some people do and some people do succeed with, I find it often helpful to, if I'm really looking at a pure, poignant idea that I'm trying to say, to analyze my own work, or to at least exist in an analytical framework. So, MatthewDiLoreto, do you feel you have a thesis for this poem, if that makes sense? If what I said makes sense. And if you cannot come up with one, we can do it together. You just need to tell me. I wish I had a classroom. I think it would be really cool to be a teacher in a classroom. Then I can look at someone and say, like, in the face. You don't have to wait for chat to respond. I think my explanation captures my goal with the piece. Finding it difficult to synthesize a thesis now. Yeah. And I think that's a great word, synthesize, right? We're taking all of this information and we want to boil it down to something pure that is going to, like, really capture it. And in your case, right, part of your thesis is trying to, like, do something for other people. I think part of your thesis is actually your process of handing someone a paper. And this means your thesis necessarily, like, involves your audience, which is, like, a whole, like, interesting thing. You start doing, like, classes in a Discord call or something. Maybe. I think at that point I would have to make it, like, workshops and, I guess I could do poetry workshops. Perhaps. So MatthewDiLoreto, maybe we can look at this and try to, like, suss out exactly what you want this poem to do. Right? Because this is long. I'm going to read this again. People need something to turn to in times of grief. And you'd say later, this is what you want people to turn to. You want to give someone an option of something to turn to. Feel tremendous yearning for what they lost, a future that is now dead to them. What they may not realize as part of their yearning is for an acknowledgement of their experience. I think that's important, right? You are saying that you realize something about grief that others might not. This is usually a good route for a thesis. Let's say an argumentative essay. I have an opinion that I don't think others realize. I'm going to argue it, right? So sort of, that they need an acknowledgement is also part of it. I can synthesize a bit. Maybe this isn't a thesis, but I want the piece to change the reader's perspective. I want them to look up out of their grief. Perfect. Looking up, looking forward, and in the looking up, they can find healing. Looking up and out to other people, perhaps? For acknowledgement, for community, for the thread, for all of this. Sometimes people provide acknowledgement. What I seek to accomplish is to serve as a bulwark, physically handing the piece, all of this. And you say here, right, I know that sadness, others do too, and this is a symbol for you to cling to. So we can use that as a sort of thesis. Basically, a piece, I'm going to use your words as much as I can. A piece to show the reader they can look up and find solace in the acknowledgement of others. Does this sound roughly right? This is sort of my rough guesstimate of what a thesis for this poem might look like. Taking all these things you that you want to do, and not even the reader, right? My loved one. Show my loved ones. Sounds good. Yeah. They can look up and find solace in the acknowledgement of others. Find the thread. So let's look back at the poem. And we have a few big parts of this thesis. Looking up. And others. That's broadly what you talk about. So, you are uniquely suffering. This is acknowledgement, right? We can do A for acknowledgement. No one will be able to understand, not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. This feels generally like a sort of acknowledgement of their pain as well. The issue sometimes that we run into is whether acknowledging and sort of helping someone realize their pain. You know, sometimes this pushes someone into like the wallowing in the sorrow, right? This sounds sort of defeating. Not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. Yeah, the audience here really matters. This isn't just a poem about my grief, but my poem to them, yeah, about their grief, except it's actually just about grief generally. Yeah, so, and I think this is good, right? It's a fundamentally personal poem. You. And I wonder, like, even to begin with, a letter to the grieving. This might be a general working title, but, you know, I would certainly, if you can, if you're planning on, like, handwriting this or typing and printing, to address this, right? Because we need, like, a personal feeling to this, I think, with the importance of the audience. You are uniquely suffering. No one will be able to understand, not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. This is a working title. I'm not sure yet who will be grieving. Right, perfect. And I think that's like a really good thing for you to already acknowledge, is that this poem is sort of probably needs to remain somewhat mutable. And that means, you know, changeable, flexible. I'd imagine there are some people who you feel these lines would resonate with less so. And I wonder if that means having versions and flexibility in different words you can use in this poem, depending on the person, right? That certainly is a way to care for them personally. I'm not sure. It's a fantastic idea. Okay. Because this is the way that you have come to understand suffering and grieving. Yet they are also in the midst of a grief that is entirely different, and they are an entirely different person, right? In the way that no one will be able to understand, I think you as the author need to understand that you will not understand them either. But I think some amount of, change, personalization, direct, connection here is going to at least help them feel seen and acknowledged, right? This simultaneously makes me like the line because you understand in your own way even more. I think this is like a deeply validating line for someone who is going through grief. Validating. Right? Because they know that they have their own way through. They know that they will get through this grief. And you are very, very well acknowledging in that line that they will, and that they have some grasp over this. It is sermon-like, but it's a sermon that suggests, if we're talking religiously, I trust your faith, I trust you in your belief, and you are sort of as strong as I am, which is like probably a very good thing to say. I should compose different versions for different people. I also find the practice of a memento mori, the contemplation of death. I ought to contemplate own version for Alice, one for Joe, etc. Yeah. And of course, I think you also in some way want to not go too far into this. I think you can definitely get lost in the weeds of making the perfect poem for any given person grieving, and that's not the point. We want to also have a distilled idea of how to communicate like grief and your acknowledgement to another person, which is, you actually, I guess, have two approaches, right? One is distill grief to an absolute essence, a purity that anyone will be able to take this poem and find joy. Or you can focus less on the absolute perfect understanding of grief as a system, and you can tailor it to your reader. One would be like a lot of effort to figure out. One would be maybe slightly less, but then consistent effort to acknowledge the people around you. I'm not sure which is better, which sounds more appealing, but both are options, and I think they require very different approaches. So, we'll keep going through this in a second. I have an ad break coming up, which tells me that I need to refill my tea. And you all should also do some sort of self-care. Tea, cozy clothing, water, bathroom, these things. Take care of yourselves, people. I will be back shortly. Welcome back. I'm still Jenny. Still known as 2/3 lettuce. Still known as... I don't know. Or alcohol. I like the idea of my poem being mutable. Maybe I should not compose a version for each person, but instead compose new versions as I go through life. Then as others experience their own grief, that is the poem. Yes! Yes! Yes, MatthewDiLoreto. This seems like a beautiful approach and piece of art. I find often the most satisfying pieces of art, the most satisfying projects, in a sense, are the ones that span very long amounts of time, that continue to change and grow alongside you. You would also end up with a record, as you continued to do this, of your own understanding and growth in grief, right? And at first, right now, you could even vastly change the approaches. You might do this later in life. You might go from a letter to the grieving to some other structure, because letters work in different ways than other forms of poetry or writing or thought, right? Sometimes I feel like you might be in a state of life where you want to distill grief down to 3 lines. Haiku, perhaps not. They're a little tacky, just by their overused nature, although part of it is that I think people don't really understand the spirit of haiku, but this is a whole nother conversation. And I think this would be beautiful. I think art that grows, art that changes, art that lives with you is beautiful. And this would be cool. This would be very cool. And then you'd be known as like Matthew, the poem guy, who's always giving people poems when they're sad. Different ones. This would be good. If it changes, you can also give someone a poem again. Right? So yeah, I like this. I'm going to read the poem again through, and then we'll talk more about figuring out what we can do to edit this poem, because this is something you want. You want it to flow better, you want the cadence like you said. And I think we can definitely work on cadence. Cadence is interesting. I haven't talked about cadence much, which is a surprise. Let's read it. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. You are uniquely suffering, and no one will be able to understand, not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs, and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. You will discover that the wound scars over. It will remain tender and the pain will still surge through you, but you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. It has passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. Look further and you will see the ancient network grief weaves. It was carried not just by this tragedy, but all others, countless beyond your knowing. Pull on the thread, let others pull on yours as well. They will need you, because you understand in your own way. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound. Let yourself be pulled. All will not be well, my friend, but be strong, and you can help yourself and others. Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. So we were somewhere around here. Grief once experienced is the invisible thread that connects us. Grief once experienced is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs and you can barely breathe. So, So something we're fundamentally trying to do, by my reading at least, is to acknowledge them, to have them look up and find acknowledgement in others. Help them to look up. So, something interesting about acknowledgement is, in some cases, you have to be sort of vague in your descriptions of things. Because if you try to acknowledge someone or help them feel acknowledged, and you say something that is off base for them, then they're not going to feel very acknowledged. Like, the harpoon is a violent, thing that puts a hole in your chest. And you say the wound throbs and you can barely breathe. Right? Of course, this depicts a great pain of sorrow. But I wonder if saying, you can barely breathe is the best description to acknowledge as many people as possible. Right, it's about trying to understand how grief feels and then make a metaphor that can encapsulate the whole thing. This is sort of what I was saying with cutting down ideas and being efficient in your ideas and finding the topic. And if we're talking about the feeling of grief as a sort of smaller topic here, and that you want to reflect how they feel, you need to make sure that the hole in the chest, the wound throbbing, and barely breathing are descriptions of pain that will be widely available or widely relatable to people. Yeah, you were right. I was imagining a friend suffering a sudden violent tragedy, like a car accident or something. This wouldn't appeal to someone who slowly watched someone succumb to Alzheimer's, for example. Totally different kinds of grief. Exactly, yeah. The grief of, let's say, the slow Alzheimer's might be a thread, a needle and a thread, weaving its way into your skin day by day, encompassing your entire body and mind, wrapping you up, snaring you until you cannot escape it. Letting myself be poetic and come up with a description there, right? Which is entirely different from a sudden tragedy harpoon to the chest. One approach, right? This is maybe the kind of thing where you could have your mutable or even modular poem. This is an odd way to describe a poem, modular, but I think it makes sense. So you could have something like one description here that you feel applies to the creeping grief. And that would be the thread being woven into you day by day, setting into your skin and your existence. The sudden grief, sometimes grief is grief for another person. Sometimes we grieve not necessarily because of our loss, but because of the loss of someone around us, or maybe our community. I live in Las Vegas, and in 2017, there was like the largest mass shooting in American history or something in Vegas. I don't know if it was like 60 something people died, hundreds injured, guy in a hotel room looking down at a music festival with like 50 automatic rifles just like shooting the crowd, right? And there was a lot of grief in the community, but it wasn't always grief because we ourselves lost something. It was a widespread communal grief, and this would require a different analogy as well to something like the jagged hole in your chest, to the creeping setting in of grief, the slow grief, the community grief, the sudden grief, and I think finding as many of these things as you can will help you in this poem. One thing you can do is write descriptions for all of these kinds of grief, let's say. And you could figure out what is the thing that relates all of them. What makes them all the same? Cross-reference them, and then find the thing that connects to everything. The center of grief. This is an approach. Or write many and insert the one that matters or that is relevant in the situation that you think for a person, right? These are the two approaches we said, sort of the modular approach, the immutable approach, and the approach of finding the pure center distillation of grief. But I do think finding the different avenues, the different understandings of grief might help you to reach your single conclusion, which would make this a very long process, because I think you would probably yourself have to feel many griefs. Sounds like a lot of your life writing about grief, if that's an approach you want to take, but it's certainly not something that runs out, so certainly a good muse. It's like Neruda writes about love. Bukowski writes about the city and what it means to be an artist. Mary Oliver writes about nature. People have muses. You could write about grief. You already do it well. You seem like you understand it well just from that comment with the difference of the car accident versus like the Alzheimer's. So like, you might notice I don't have solid advice for you. I'm giving you very broad things. But I think like this kind of section is the one that you want to be very careful about, because of the ways that it can fail to apply to people, right? If you're trying to have someone feel acknowledged, you better do your darndest to like be acknowledgeable, or be a actually like useful thing. Absolutely love the idea of the modular stanzas. My mind is already buzzing with the possibility. Beautiful, MatthewDiLoreto. This also makes like a really interesting. This makes a really interesting, like, broader piece of art where you have bits and pieces of the poem scattered throughout the people who are close to you. And it turns out if they pull on the threads of each other, they might find new ways to acknowledge grief through the differentiated poems that they each have. Which is such like a high level like piece of art at that point that that's so cool. Like literally in the way that they can pull on the threads that you have woven between them with your art, that they can find new understanding of each other and understanding of grief. Whoa. It's So cool. High Caliber. You've been a bad boy. You redeemed, I time you out and call you a bad boy. And High Caliber, this you have been, because you want it, / timeout at High Caliber 300. Come back in 5 minutes. You've been bad. I want to embody the spirit of the poem. That is, yeah. The poem can be the thread in the same way that grief is the thread. You definitely need to give people these poems tied up in thread. It's like it's too perfect to not, right? I wonder if there's like a metaphor in here about tying knots. I mean, there certainly is. I don't know if it's one you want to use. Just because we're trying to be straightforward. You will discover that the wound scars over. So, I'm actually not sure how I feel about this line. This sort of gives that echo, as you were saying earlier, of like, things will get better. Which shifts the focus to like providing hope, right? Which isn't exactly what we said in the outline. Of course, we want to help them. We want to help them look up. But this line does feel like the sort of... Like, I think anything of, like, telling someone what will happen is almost not acknowledging their space and their time to come to an understanding of grief themselves. But you also, in some way, do want to, like, provide them a bit of hope. Which maybe we need to, like, veil the idea of the wound scarring a little bit. Instead of saying you will discover, right? You could say something, not that you will, but by the time the wound scars over, or even when the wound has scarred over. I just think like you will discover feels very much of like an imposition of experience onto them, saying what will happen. I don't think you want to say so much what will happen as they go through grief, but which, I mean, like, when it, like, I can't quite put into words what I'm trying to say, because saying, like, when the wound scars over, in a way is still saying what will happen, but I guess saying what they will do, or how they will react, or how they will come to an understanding, is possibly a dangerous move. You don't want to prescribe. Like maybe that is too specific, too direct of a line. Yes, you are right. I don't exactly come back to the scar. I just say that it will keep hurting, just less or blunted. Yeah. Yeah. It will remain tender and the pain will still surge through you. But you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. Like, I'm not sure whether I like you will see, you will discover, but I also might actually like these lines. Like, I don't know how to feel about that. Like, if I received this poem and someone said, you will do these things, like, I feel like there's a world where I react badly to that, because my grieving is my own and my grieving is personal. And this puts some sort of outward imposition or pressure onto my grieving. This is extraordinarily nitty-gritty, right? But this is what we're doing. This is what you want. You will see, right? And it's not useful to talk about like my experience or what I have seen either. I was thinking the whole time that some parts of this would make me angry if I was grieving. So, Drowning Devil, since everyone is, I think, free to help MatthewDiLoreto with this poem, we can even check. Are you open to chat providing critique and feedback? Yes. Drowning Devil, what parts of this poem would rub you the wrong way in a time of grief? Right? This sort of crowdsourcing is probably what's going to help MatthewDiLoreto come to a point where the poem is much, much stronger, right? Be a critic too, or a point of aid, Drowning Devil. Which lines? You can do line number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. That's a way to do it. MatthewDiLoreto, thank you so much for the gifted sub. That means so much. Thank you. That's the sort of thing that like moves me toward being able to like support myself off of this. Thank you so much for your help. I wish I didn't have to leave, but I do. Well, I think you also consented in the forum to this going on YouTube. So this will be up on the YouTube playlist. It'll probably be next week. So if you want to see it, you can watch it on YouTube there. Also, the VOD goes up automatically and immediately on Twitch as soon as the stream is over. So you can just skip 2 hours in and you will see from right here the rest of this analysis. Of course, you won't be able to participate, but I think we will still be able to make a lot of progress on this poem. And I'm really glad it helped. And I hope the rest of it helps too if you get a chance to watch it. Have a good one, MatthewDiLoreto. Absolutely, I can't wait to see. Awesome. Yeah, take your time, reread it. I hope it's like able to be made out on screen. I think it's pretty legible, should be on your Twitch to read. Maybe as you do that, I'm going to keep going into this stanza. You'll also see the thread carried by the harpoon always remains. It has passed through you and those around you. I like you and those around you because this is pretty much a reminder, like, this is the reminder you are not alone, which is a bit, like, tacky in a time of grief, but putting it behind a metaphor, we are physically connected to each other. We can pull on the threads of others. We can help heal our wounds and others. Like, this is probably a much better way to say the unpoetic, you are not alone, right? You are not alone is about, like, the most poetic, like, a non-poet will get in trying to help someone. But I think saying fundamentally, we have been struck by a harpoon and we have been bound by the threads of grief that now connect us, and it has passed through myself, you, and everyone around you. This is probably a better way to say that kind of phrase. So I really do like that specific line. And something you can definitely do, MatthewDiLoreto, is, I've said some lines that I really like, right? It has passed through you and those around you. You are uniquely suffering. Try to find what about those lines you like. Try to figure out why I like them, because I can't always, I'm going to try to express why I like them. But these are definitely things to look at, right? Because I don't say I like every line. I like the poem, but... okay. Maybe it's more the idea how the poem was being given that would upset me. Because rereading this, while I think of myself in that circumstance, I can't help but feel personally like I was being talked down to, or that my grief was turned into something rather simple. Interesting. Like, almost the fact that if your grief, like that your grief could be addressed within just a short poem, is that sort of what would be be the condescending nature, like that, oh, here's 15 lines of writing and this is going to get you through it. Okay, exactly, yeah. Perfect. I think this is something to acknowledge, and this matters in the approach, right? I think if we're like at a wake, there's a bunch of people and they're all like sad. I don't know how to draw this, right? And you come up and you just hand them a poem and walk away, and it's like, this is what you need. Then yeah, that's going to be like pretty awful, right? That in this, if this was given to me at a funeral, I'd be like, why are you making this about your poem and not the dead person in front of us? True that, right? So I think that's very important. And this is like a really, really good point. How would we parse this, right? We need to make it not about the poem. Like, the poem's important. The poem will help you through your grief. But it's not about my poem or my piece of art, because that's, like, selfish. And this is an interesting thing, because I talk about art as sometimes a selfish thing. Art as something that requires the ego, the artistic ego. I say this every so often on stream. And when I say the artistic ego every so often on stream, what am I saying? I'm saying that by handing you my poem, by handing you my work, I am fundamentally thinking that you will read it, take something from it, appreciate it, and that my poem will help you. This is sort of an egotistical or an ego-driven thing. It's not bad, but there's some amount of ego always in saying my poem is worth listening to. And in the context of grief and a funeral, many people don't want to see what you find as worth listening to. Many people don't want your sort of imposition on that. They want their own grieving. They want their own process. They want the acknowledgement. But this might feel very self-centered. I'm not sure it is, though. And I think some amount of it is how we approach that handing of the poem. Right? Hand them the poem, walk away. It's like, well, what the heck, dude? Like, come on, this thing's not going to help me. But if it's something deeply caring, right? If it's, I made this for you, and this is a loved one. So if it is personal, if it is for you, like, if you're just like handing out your folded up poems, like a religious person handing out pamphlets on the street, this is a bad look. This is not what we should be doing. But if it is for you, if it is, I think, not the only thing is probably important, right? Of course, the poem can help as a sort of symbol, but I think necessarily we need to also physically be a shoulder for the person, right? We need to be present in their lives and probably help them a little bit through their grief before we ever even like pull out the poem. It should be like, okay, I've helped you, I've talked to you, I've listened to you, and then maybe even later I come back with the poem, or I give it to them after that, right? Honestly, I personally don't think there's a good way to do this while still at the funeral or wake. Yeah, and maybe part of it for you is the setting. Maybe this shouldn't be done like immediately in that moment, because this poem is also geared toward like the longer term idea of the process of healing. So maybe it shouldn't be about a momentary thing. It should be later, right? Though I think that funerals and wakes should always be about the dead and not the grieving people. I don't know, that's an odd thought, but that's how I see it. That's true, right? This poem doesn't really mention the object of the grief, and really the only way it does is as like a harpoon and a thread. And I think you might also be feeling, Drowning Devil, that this poem diminishes the object of grief. We're not talking about our best friend or grandpa or whatever. We're veiling the grief itself in a metaphor, and many people don't even want the one level of metaphor. They want, someone to say to your face directly that, like, I love you, we loved this person, and I'm gonna cry on your shoulder. Like, directness. And you're a very direct person, Drowning Devil, so this maybe makes sense, and I simultaneously don't mean to assume. Yeah, exactly. Okay. But I think there is a danger, right, in veiling this in metaphor, which could mean either in our sort of modular nature, MatthewDiLoreto, we include some capacity for personalization of the object of grief, or we give something like this poem at a greater distance, where maybe the person has already begun to attend to the bleeding, or they're at a point where maybe they should be, not that there's a timeline on grieving, but that it's sort of time to start healing oneself. God, I wish they were still here. I would love to hear their thoughts on this. Absolutely. And I don't know if they're in the Discord yet, but at least like next stream, I think there's like a very good conversation to be had over this poem, and I do hope as you watch the VOD, MatthewDiLoreto, that you consider sending further iterations, because I think there's a whole lot of conversations involved in this poem, not just about poetry, but about the setting of being a poet and how to communicate your art to other people. And we clearly have many, many different ideas on how to do that. And I personally still absolutely love this concept. I think it's beautiful. I think it would help. But I'm also someone who is way too head in the clouds with poetry, and I don't really understand other people very well. So, as poets, I think we tend to be a little skewed on how our poetry happens. Now, Drowning Devil, I think you have a much more level head than I do. I'm not saying you're not a poet, because you're a great poet. But you see things like that differently. So it's important, right? Oh, what a great discussion so far, right? I think those are really good points to consider, Drowning Devil. Let's continue, right? You will discover the wound's scars over. Remain tender and the pain will surge through you, but you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains. It's passed through you and those around you. Pull on it and draw them close. I also think this is probably objectively good advice. Pull on it and draw them close. The stuff about community and suffering through things together is probably never wrong. At least once you've previously established some requisite amount of healing yourself, because we don't want a sort of codependence through suffering. And the poem does establish this. We talked at the very beginning of how I thought this was a great timeline through a grieving process, right? And this is a poem that personally would help me if I was grieving. This is a poem that I personally, honestly, genuinely would consider going back to in a time of grieving in my future, because I think this is already very well done. But it's already very well done for some people. And I think Drowning Devil and our talks about the flexibility, the modularity of the poem, these speak to the point that also you are uniquely suffering. And thus, you are uniquely going to react to this poem, which is putting this very difficult task ahead of you, basically. You, MatthewDiLoreto. Look further and you will see the ancient network grief weaves. And it was carried not just by this tragedy, but all others countless beyond your knowing. If we're talking about parts of this poem that I find less compelling or like my least favorite, it's this. This line is not my jam. And this maybe goes along with something that Drowning Devil said, like the matter at hand, the grieving, the person who we have lost, the thing we have lost, the object of grief. This says look further. This says look at the ancient network, which I do like the network, but it says all other tragedies, not just this tragedy. There's a beautiful point here, a point that we talked about when I was talking about like the broad issues of life. I just deleted half the Buddha, and how we like relate to each other, right? It speaks well on a sort of his ears, on a sort of cosmic level, I guess, or a universal level amongst people. But people don't always want universality in their individual time of grief. And talking about other tragedies, the countless beyond your knowing, might be taken in a condescending manner. Of course, you might know that this line would help someone. This line would help someone like me, in fact, right? Seeing the bigger picture, seeing the wide things, this is how I tend to think. Like, I do think I can appreciate this line. I also think a lot of people won't. But, like, generally, like, I like these stanzas a lot. They just have, like, they're, like, nitty-gritty issues. This stanza feels like I like it, but there's probably some, like, very deep issues with this, right? Welcome, Nico. MatthewDiLoreto had to leave a few minutes ago, and we're still on his poem, but really enjoying it. And welcome, you've been overbooking yourself. That's I hope it's not too much. I hope you're taking care of yourself, Nico, still. Sounds like we're sort of moving out of that period of rest from about a month ago, right? So I pull on the thread and let others pull on yours as well. They will need you because you understand in your own way. This line again, I like deeply in its validation, because they will need you because you understand in your own way. It's another one of these reminders to stay connected in a time like this. And I do like your thread. I like your ideas about connection. I like your ideas about, your poetic thesis. Look up. See, don't just look at your feet. Don't just be focused on getting through this yourself. Like, you will need to do that to be able to look up in some way. But you also need to find ways to help others and be helped by others, right? And be acknowledged by others. So the thread I like a lot as a metaphor here. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound, let yourself be pulled. It's fine. I'm not sure if like this all has quite the impact of the prior line. It feels almost like an elaboration of what you say very well in one line. Like sometimes we do this in poetry. We end up like elaborating when we don't always need to. And we might need to here, because also like not everyone we're giving this poem to is going to, no one, so to be clear, MatthewDiLoreto, no one is going to look at your poem like this. In fact, no one who you give your poem to will sit with it for 2 hours and 15 minutes and many colors of pens and highlighters. So sometimes we do need elaboration. Like the fear, the danger that we run into when we distill our language. When we distill our ideas, if we do this all too much, it can get sort of confusing. And this goes back, like, literally last stream, we were talking more deeply about the specificity graph. My favorite thing on stream. right? The graph, specificity, interpretations, right? The more specific you are, the closer you get to a single interpretation. The less specific you are, the more interpretations you get, and at some point you're not specific enough and the person gets confused. And then there is like nothing, right? And it's probably actually more like that, right? And this graph changes depending on where you are. Me, for example, you can probably be less specific with me and get still interpretations, and probably more because I hate coming to a single interpretation. Some people interpret a lot of poetry in a very similar way, and will sort of always do that, right? This is maybe a description of how different people read, right? The specificity graph. And you need to decide, as we distill, we sometimes get less specific because we lose elaboration, right? And we want to make sure we're not getting too far to the left of a sort of like non-poetically read person so that they don't just get confused. We don't want to confuse someone with a poem that's supposed to help them. So something like cutting out 2 lines that sort of elaborate: you will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound, let yourself be pulled. Like, I think all of this in a way is described up here and in the prior line, right? But we might need to say it again just to like get our message communicated. But that's like, it again depends on your audience. Audience is important, especially with what you're trying to do. So, all will not be well, my friend, but be strong and you can help yourself and others. Be strong is hard sometimes because like grief sometimes makes us feel like we cannot do anything. We are paralyzed. We are unable to find strength at all. We can barely breathe. You said it yourself in the poem. So an advice like be strong. This is one of those like general platitudes that I think are fundamentally pretty looked down upon. Be strong. We'll get through this together. It'll be better on the other side. I understand. Right. So we might need to, this could even be hold tight to the thread. Right? We don't need to, quote, be strong, but we can hold tight to that thread that connects us, which has a strength to it. The holding, gripping tight, maybe. But not just be strong. Also, I just feel it's odd to describe someone who just died as an object. I'm honestly not sure how else you would write the metaphor, but I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't think... So, I think what I'm thinking is we actually never talk about the person. We talk about the feeling of grief. We talk about the harpoon as the grief that hits us. And then we talk about the thread as sort of the way we heal, the way we are bound by grief. But, Drowning Devil, like, it's interesting that you connect it to the person, because oftentimes when we're grieving, like you said, we really care about the actual object of grief. And I say object in terms of like subject-object, right? The thing that we exist in regards to, or that the grief exists in regards to. So the object of the grief, be it a person, be it a dog, be it a lost heirloom, this is just not described in the poem, but we might expect it to be. So we need to think about our reader. If you're reading this and you want to see something about the person who just died, they might associate the harpoon with the person, like you did, Drowning Devil. This is also a matter of like specificity and knowing. Like, I think this is a beautiful poem to indicate the ways we need to be specific and non-specific at the same time. I think it's a fundamental dichotomy of poetry. We can't just say something outright because then it's not poetry. We have to be non-specific, but then people can like not interpret what we want. Of course, we should respect their interpretation. I don't believe in like a misinterpretation. But as an author, we have an intent, and we need to try to get them where we want to if we're writing a poem where we want them to get somewhere. And it's this back and forth balance of like these impossible scales that you can't get perfectly, right? Honestly, this poem is pretty outside of the context. This poem is very pretty outside of the context of how it will be shared. So you don't like the delivery, like the hypothetical handing this to someone in grief, but you like the poem itself. I think the poem is beautiful as well. You submitted, King Pollo? Excellent. Excellent. You are in line. This is an interesting point, Drowning Devil. And I think that's definitely something you should consider, MatthewDiLoreto, as you go forward with it. Like, how do I present this? It's just like a poem being a spoken word poem. Some things are not meant to be read out loud. They don't work out loud. I have poems with a bunch of... This was a bad idea. It's dangerous to open Twitter because there can be like nudity on your front page. I write poems sometimes with parentheticals in them, and I don't know if it's on here or the other socials, right? But sometimes I think it's on, yeah, here. So this poem, you see it, and this is like blurry, so I'll fix it. This poem, there we go. You see it, question mark. I see perfect futures in the back of my head, roads of aurum, roads of amber. I see motionless death in the real-life city, roads of asphalt, roads of aurum. I see it on it, the road. Beneath it, my feet, I see it inside it all, the it, amber of the it, asphalt. This is like an abhorrent spoken word poem. I would never get on a stage and read this poem out loud because you cannot express parentheticals, right? Through speech. I find it a travesty. I find it a travesty of our existence, subjugated to the English language, that we have no good way to speak a parenthetical except by like holding up parentheses with your hands. I love parentheticals. They're one of my favorite devices to use. But point being of all this, not to get too off topic into my like rant, is that some things are not meant to be, shared or performed in certain ways. That poem works great on paper, and in fact works great on social media because it fits within a character count. It does not work. It would work in a collection. It would not work spoken. It would not work in other settings, probably, right? And so we need to be deeply careful of the context, right? And I could share that poem with some friends and they might like it. I could share it with other friends and they wouldn't like it. And this is very hard. This is a very, very, very difficult thing to deal with as a poet. Knowing when to share your work, in what contexts, and how. Right? Devil, you still have problems with it, of course, but my main issue is the presentation. I like this criticism. I really like when y'all are critical of each other, because it helps different perspectives coming to things. Nico, you sent that message a bit ago, but you're stepping out. Happy unmoderated time. I need another moderator. 2 maybe. But so that's a thing that is to be considered, and I would take Drowning Devil's advice very seriously, because everyone has a different expectation in a certain setting of how they want to approach it. Some people think a certain poem would be great at an open mic, and then you read it and someone else is like, this is awful. I mean, I don't think we should often be judging like others' poems as awful, but like some people just have taste that's like, I don't want to listen to this, or this doesn't fit in the setting. Maybe someone will do stand-up comedy at an open mic, and some people are like, I don't want to hear stand-up comedy at this open mic. I just want to hear music and poetry, or just poetry, or just music. And in the very same way, we need to think about the person we hand our poem to, and the place that we hand this person our poem, and the mental state they're in, and the mental state we're in, and our relation to them prior. So this is like a nightmare, probably, to think about. But we're also dealing in this poem with a very, dangerous time. Dangerous in the sense of sharing art, because the reception could be poor. Dangerous because you might share a poem that makes someone feel angry at you. And these are also people who have emotions, if we're grieving, that are very inflamed. People might be easy to anger in ways that they're not normally. People might be more prone to really liking your poem because they're in a time where the poem helps them. I think we should definitely look at it in both ways. I think this setting has great advantages. We're capturing people at a time where they need connection. They need something to turn to. They might need a regular, symbol, piece of contact to the world that helps them grieve, and that could be this poem. So I don't think the fact of it being a time of grief is only a bad thing for you. There are many advantageous aspects to sharing a poem with a grieving person, which sounds almost egotistical, right? Where it's I'm using this as a time to share my art because it's advantageous, but advantageous in the terms of helping someone feel an emotion that helps them, right? This is what we want as artists. We want to communicate. And if it's a time where communication is needed, then it's probably a good time to share poetry too. I think that's all for this one. I think I'm going to end this one here. Maybe yap about it a little bit, but I need to read it one more time, and then there's going to be an ad break. So here we go. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. You are uniquely suffering, and no one will be able to understand. Not to any extent that would alleviate your sorrow. Grief, once experienced, is the invisible thread that connects us. Carried on a harpoon through tragedy, it tears a jagged hole through your chest. The wound throbs and you can barely breathe. Attend to the bleeding now. You will discover that the wound scars over. It will remain tender and the pain will still surge through you, but you will also see the thread carried by that harpoon always remains and has passed through you, and those around you pull on it and draw them close. Look further and you will see the ancient network grief weaves. It is carried not just by this tragedy, but all others, countless beyond your own knowing. Pull on the thread and let others pull on yours as well. They will need you because you understand in your own way. You will feel the throbbing when you are pulled, but do not turn away. Attend to your wound, but let yourself be pulled. And all will not be well, my friend. But be strong, and you can help yourself and others. A Letter to the Grieving by MatthewDiLoreto. Thank you for watching. I encourage you to check out the rest of the series, follow if you enjoyed, and stop by Twitch if you want to share your own work. See you there.